A woman reached out to me this morning with a question. What can we do to change the foster care system? How do we get the masses to hear our voices to change the legal abuse and drugging of innocent children? There are hundreds of thousands of stories, but our voices were never heard, and most feel they still don't matter. So there's a lot to this question, and it's a difficult one to answer, but I'll do my best to answer it within my limited capability. So, as with any problem, the first step is to identify what it is. We have to identify how it affects everyone and how our own prejudices and biases maintain the system. I like to think of someone like Thomas Jefferson, who describes slavery as a political depravity. The condition and degree of suffering to which oppression has reduced the man of one color, with a condition and degree of suffering to which oppression has reduced the man of another color, equally condemning both. Those sound like powerful insights regarding the condition of slavery from a man far ahead of his time. However, when you recognize that Jefferson was a slaveholder, that he believed slaves had a better life than the common laborer of England, and that the only way to truly abolish slavery was to remove people of color beyond the reach of mixture for fear that they might quote-unquote stain the blood of their masters, you can start to see how someone like Jefferson also perpetuated the very system that he professed the desire to abolish. One of the things that I have tried to do on my show is question the narrative of whether it is best to remove children from an abusive home. It seems right. Even to me, it seems right, at least in some cases. It seems like the best thing to do for a child who's been subjected to abuse or neglect, to place them in an environment different from the one they are currently living in. On the other hand, reactive attachment disorder was first introduced to the DSM-3 after it was identified as a disorder affecting a high percentage of children in institutional care. When I consider that, it makes me wonder whether removing them is, in fact, the best solution. When we are literally creating a disorder in the very children that we say we are trying to protect, I feel we have to stop and question whether what we're doing is right. Part of what I try to do on my show, The Real Victims of CPS, is to identify what the problems are with the foster care system as it exists today. I often remark on the fact that 30% of all social workers involved in foster care placement have no degree related to social work. Only 16% even have a degree in social work. There's often a narrative that the overwhelming majority of children are returned to their parents, but that's not the case. In 2019, only 56% of children in the foster care system were returned to their parents. 56%. That's not an overwhelming majority. That's barely a majority. If the ultimate goal of Child Protective Services is to preserve the family and keep children in their homes whenever possible, then we're doing a terrible job of living up to that goal. So that's the problem. What's the solution? Personally, there are a lot of things I could see us doing. I love the idea that one of my guests suggested, that we put cameras in the homes and require caseworkers to wear body cams or some other recording device when conducting interviews so that there is transparency in the monitoring of the families in their care. I think actually funding children's services would help, which may seem strange considering the fact that they're the ones that are taking the kids. But when you think about it, in Ohio, between 2010 and 2016, the number of children in the system rose by 18.5%, while funding dropped by 15.1%. We can't ensure proper investigations into these cases if we're cutting the number of caseworkers as the numbers of children in their care rise. In addition to the mandatory reporting guide, social workers need training in criminal investigations and child psychology so that they can conduct their investigations with more understanding and insight into their care cases. But perhaps the biggest thing that I think would make the most substantial impact would be to provide social services to parents whose children have been taken away. food stamps, healthcare, rental assistance, housing assistance, legal assistance, employment assistance. It may sound counterintuitive, but these are important services for parents to be able to provide a healthy environment for their children when they return home. They also help parents complete their case plans, since they need to devote substantial time to completing classes, individual therapy, and addiction recovery, and many of them have to quit their jobs and become homeless in order to do that. If we want to make the system child-centered, as we say we do, we need to focus on providing parents with resources that they can use to provide their children a safe environment when they return home. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. That's all well and good, Brian, but how are we going to pay for something like that? Here's the thing. We are already paying for it. 80% of inmates incarcerated in the United States spent time in foster care. In LA County, it now costs roughly $770,000 to incarcerate a teen. 40 to 50% of former foster youth find themselves homeless less than 18 months after leaving the system. The government spends nearly $36,000 on each homeless person in the United States. Most damning of all is that young women in foster care are more than twice as likely to become pregnant as teenagers, and half of their kids will wind up in foster care themselves. We're already paying for it. As for the final part of this question, how do we make people aware of these issues when they continue to ignore them? Consider this. Before 1973, homosexuality was listed in the DSM as a mental illness. As therapists, it was our job to try and cure people of their homosexuality, but instead we were killing them. It wasn't until 1970 that activists interrupted the APA's annual convention and the conversation started to change. 3 years later, Robert Spitzer, the chair of the APA's task force on the DSM-3, led a successful effort to remove homosexuality as a mental health disorder. As Margaret Mead said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So keep making your voices heard. Keep pounding on the doors. Keep interrupting those conversations, because it's the only way we're ever going to change the system.